Now, for more on challenges facing global economies, especially developing countries, I sat down for an exclusive interview with World Bank President Yong Kim. I began by asking Dr. Kim what progress has been made on the World Bank's ambitious efforts to end extreme poverty within a generation, as well as boost shared prosperity.
You know, there's some great news, Tracy. I mean, we are now below 10% in terms of the number of people living in extreme poverty in the world, so we're down to about 700 million. And a huge part of that was, of course, growth in China. I mean, China lifted 600 million people out of poverty over the last 20 years or so. But now the low-hanging fruit are all gone, and it's going to be tough going. So for the last 700 million, we have to really focus on things like fragile and conflict-affected states. And unfortunately, the number of fragile and conflict-affected states is growing almost on a daily basis.
The goalpost was, of course, ending extreme poverty by 2030. But if the recovery in these emerging economies is not as fast or accelerated as you'd like to see, do you think that we might have to revise that date at some point?
Not yet. The whole point of setting a target with an expiration date is that you've got to continuously change what you do so that you're on track. And so, for example, right now, what are the problems? Well, low commodity prices have affected growth in developing countries. The relative difficulty now of getting access to capital has affected developing countries, and also just instability has affected growth in developing countries. And all of these things, in addition to trade growth in trade being the lowest that it's been over now more than 5 years now at less than 3% growth. All of these things are affecting developing countries. So what we have to do is we've got to find ways of making access to capital easier for the developing countries. We have to help countries diversify. Those that depended on commodity exports now need to find other ways of creating jobs. And you know, it's difficult to increase trade just as an institution like the World Bank Group. But we know that the more trade there is, the more it benefits the poorest countries.
One of the top global trends at the World Economic Forum last year was income inequality. Yet when we look at the gap between the rich and the poor, both in developing and developed economies, that gap has only been growing wider. What can be done to stem the widening of the gap?
I think the figures that you see, the top 80 people in the world, have access to as much wealth as the bottom 50% of the world. I think the remarkable thing there is the bottom 50% of the world has access to only 0.7% of the wealth of the world. One of the things we're doing is working on tax systems. Unfortunately, in most developing countries, tax systems are regressive. In other words, the poor pay more taxes than the rich proportionately. And if you're powerful enough, you just somehow don't pay taxes. And this happens everywhere. We've got to get rid of these regressive systems that are not transparent, that are not effective. And along with the IMF, we are now working to help developing countries improve their tax collection.
We know that emerging economies are not doing as well in recent years. In fact, this is reflected in World Bank lending. A recent World Bank press release actually says that lending is at levels not seen outside of a financial crisis. That sounds pretty bad to me. How would you describe the scenario? We've
seen increased demand in really two forms. So on the one hand, especially the commodity exporters are now coming back to us and asking for help. And this is for money for infrastructure investments. It's for money that goes directly into their budget support instruments that support structural reforms. But we're also seeing demand on another level. So the global community has asked us to step up in terms of fighting pandemics. They've asked us to step up in terms of tackling climate change. And now we're very involved in tackling the forced displacement crisis, refugees.
Dr. Kim, a lot of this World Bank lending, if you could identify some of the big countries where this money is going to, what are those countries and where in particular is that money going to?
So, there are some new countries that have come on board now that weren't borrowing from us before, like Angola, right? Angola, another oil exporter, hasn't been borrowing from us for a while, but now feels that need. Throughout Africa, there's a huge demand for resources. Again, part of it's because so many of the African countries were dependent on commodity exports. Latin America, demand is also very high. I think the demand for our services, for our capital in the Middle East and North Africa is going to continue to go up and go up very rapidly. I mean, just imagine once there's peace in Syria, there are estimates that it'll be hundreds of billions of dollars required to rebuild Syria.
When you met with German Chancellor Angela Merkel last week, what were some of the things that you guys discussed? And did you get a sense that there is a consensus amongst European leaders as to how best to tackle this refugee crisis?
There is a global pact that everyone has agreed to, that when there's a refugee crisis, that all of the countries would share the burden of receiving them. And Germany has done so much more than their share in this regard. I think everyone's struggling to find solutions to this particular problem. There were 1 million or 700,000 last year. They're thinking there'll be more than 1 million this year. As the weather warms up, as the seas become calmer, there are going to be more and more people coming. This is a fundamental crisis for the European countries. I think the one thing that all the European leaders agree on is that we have to go upstream. We have to go to the Middle East and North Africa and see if we can build stability, growth, optimism, and some form of prosperity that's more widely shared on the ground if we're going to tackle the problem of refugees leaving.
You're the first World Bank president who does not come from a financial or political background. You're a physician by training, an MD. What's harder, being a physician or being a World Bank president? And are there any transferable skills there?
I loved being a doctor. I really enjoyed seeing patients. But being the World Bank president, I just can't imagine a better job, certainly for me, because not only do you get to learn all these new areas, I mean, I learn about finance and macroeconomics, of course, but I also learn about road building and bridge building and energy. I get to learn about everything. So for someone who's been a student all his life, getting to learn all these new things is fantastic. But as a doctor, you treat one patient at a time. But if you can grow an economy, I mean, you lift up literally hundreds of millions and sometimes even billions of people. So as a person focused on human suffering, as a person who grew up and trained focusing on relieving human suffering, being the World Bank Group president is the best job I can imagine.